I'm boiling mad and sick at the same time that it's gotten here. Every prediction under the sun, nobody predicted this. Nobody predicted this. You've got the U.S. Congress passing a health care bill that is based on the Commerce Clause being stretched. It is how everybody thought this case was going to be decided. How many of you, when you considered every possibility here, you know what, I think the court's going to actually end up calling this a tax increase? Who in their right mind would think that? Who in their right mind would predict that as the ultimate way in which the case would be decided?
My ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is. Through the Force, things you will see other places, the future.
The argument was made by the Solicitor General, and I argued, as did some others, that there were separate stools on which Congress could stand. One of them on which we argued that Congress could stand alone is the taxing power. And indeed, in the fall of 1977, when Chief Justice Roberts was a student in my course, I was finishing up a treatise on constitutional law whose main chapter on the taxing power argued that that power was alone sufficient, given its breadth, to provide all of the incentives that Congress needed.
It's important to be clear about what the only seriously challenged provision of this act actually does. The challenged provision creates an economic incentive for individuals to purchase health insurance if they have taxable income and are not covered already. That's all it does.
There is nothing hidden about the fact that this bill operates entirely through increasing the income tax liability of people who don't purchase the insurance that's required.
The taxing power provides an additional and independent pillar to support the mandate as a device to simultaneously raise revenue for the general welfare and encourage conduct that Congress has ample power to encourage. The surcharge is calculated as a percentage of household income. It's subject to a floor and to a cap. It isn't imposed on anyone who isn't required to file an income tax return for a given year. And it isn't nearly steep enough to be punitive. The term tax appears some 40 times in the minimum coverage provision, so that those who say that nobody called it a tax just haven't read it. Core parts of it were placed in the Internal Revenue Code. So the Act's individual mandate is sustainable. It has a provision that operates simply through adjusting people's federal income tax liability.
The first major victory that the opponents scored against the Affordable Care Act was one of characterization. A major lesson of thinking about the Constitution is that a lot turns on how you get people to think about something. They framed the issue as this is a law that imposes an obligation conditioned merely on existing. The only way you can avoid it is to go to the Cayman Islands or to Switzerland or commit suicide. Well, that's really not true. It is triggered by earning a bunch of money. You don't have to become one of the 1%, but you've got to earn enough money to be above the threshold. It is a law imposed as a regulation triggered by earning money. The only enforcement of that mandate, it was not that people were dragged into the insurance office. It's not that they were put in jail for not buying it. The only enforcement was your taxes are going to be adjusted upward by a certain amount, calculated as a percentage of household income, capped at the price of the foregone insurance coverage, assessed and collected through the civil enforcement mechanisms of the Internal Revenue Service. Point 18, maybe this is just a tax adjustment. You'll see that in the blog post I wrote back last fall, I was saying this could be supported under the tax power. There are a lot of precedents saying that the tax power gives Congress the power to raise and support armies and do other things with taxes, even if it's not necessarily called a tax. The U.S. Supreme Court could become the first court to uphold the Affordable Care Act under the taxing power. What it could do is say, we have a duty not to gratuitously invalidate an act of Congress. We have a duty to interpret it in such a way as to support its constitutionality. How would it interpret this to make it a constitutional exercise of the taxing power? Well, it would say, we interpret it to mean that you are in compliance with the law as long as you pay the tax. We just eliminate one sentence. In fact, Kavanaugh, in his dissent from the D.C. Circuit, said it's a minor tweak in the law. That's all it would require to make it constitutional. It's sort of crazy to invalidate it because there's that little provision that says, well, you're a lawbreaker, although there are no penalties. I was holding my breath, in the Supreme Court courtroom as the Solicitor General defended the Affordable Care Act. From my perspective, there were three particularly encouraging signs. There was an interesting point that Roberts made a couple of times on Monday, and that was he didn't think it made any sense to view the mandate as a freestanding obligation to purchase insurance, separate and apart from the tax penalty for not doing so. The law simply says to people, you have a choice. It's not really a mandate, even though it's called one. You have a choice, either buy insurance or see your tax bill go up a little bit to compensate for the fact that you didn't buy it and are thereby imposing costs on others. If it's seen as a choice, and if you're not viewed as a lawbreaker, as long as you pay the penalty, though you don't comply with the so-called mandate, then the taxing power becomes a much more available basis to uphold what Congress did in the Affordable Care Act. And when the Solicitor General was pressed, what if somebody, for example, is on probation and is asked, have you violated any federal law lately? Could the person truthfully answer, no, I haven't, even though the person didn't purchase the required insurance, but merely paid the penalty? The Solicitor General said, I assure the court, and he's in a position to do so, given his pivotal place in the Justice Department and in the government, I assure the court that anyone who pays the penalty when required will not be deemed a lawbreaker from the perspective of the United States government. Well, given that assurance, it becomes considerably more plausible to see the law upheld under the taxing power, as Judge Kavanaugh suggested it would if the law were interpreted this way.
Joining me now, Laurence H, a Harvard Law School professor.
I do think that the court will surprise a lot of people when it probably upholds the Affordable Care Act in an opinion by another former student of mine, Chief Justice Roberts.
You do think it's going to be
Thursday.
upheld in its entirety?
I think it will be upheld in its entirety. I would expect the Chief Justice to write an opinion, perhaps saying that the mandate isn't really a mandate at all, but a choice that people have, either to purchase health insurance or to pay more taxes so that there isn't as much free riding.
Thank you, Professor Laurence H. It's an honor to have you on. We'll see if you're engaging in wishful thinking or brilliant clairvoyance.
I noticed while I was watching the argument some pretty clear signals from the Chief Justice, although I was surprised others didn't seem to note these, that he was considering the possibility that although this was called a mandate, since it operates exactly like a tax, it simply increases the tax liability of people otherwise eligible to pay taxes for those who would impose a free ride on others, that it's really a tax after all. And that's why I predicted before the decision that it would come out in favor of the Affordable Care Act, and that the Chief Justice would probably, as I said on the air on a couple of stations, conclude that it was a tax.
How many of you, when you considered every possibility here, you know what, I think the court's going to actually end up calling this a tax increase? Who in their right mind would predict that as the ultimate way in which the case would be decided? Nobody.
Always with you what cannot be done.
Every prediction under the sun, nobody predicted this. Nobody predicted this.
That is why you fail.